What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another draft video for the Detroit Lions, and today we are diving into the second round of this year's draft for the Lions at pick number 34 with a tight end out of Iowa, Sam LaPorta. So let's get it started. Welcome, everybody, to another video. Glad you guys are here, and I'm very excited to do this video, man. This is going to be a pretty fun breakdown. As always, I'm going to try to do this as quick as possible. You can expect that this is going to be a little bit on the longer side of a video. We have a video up on Jahmyr Gibbs and also Jack Campbell, so feel free to go check those out. This time we're going back to the offensive side of the ball, staying in Iowa though with the tight end. And now before we get into who Sam LaPorta is, of course he is a tight end, I first want to start with this quote that I found from Coach Kirk Ferentz of the Iowa Hawkeyes. Now he's well respected around the league, even Brad Holmes hit on it. When you draft guys like this, from Iowa or for Alabama, you kind of know what type of player you are getting. They'll play special teams, they play in the bowl games, right? They finish the season, they return from injuries, the type of player that you get in terms of the way that they play the game. And this is a quote that stood out. There's a lot of good quotes, but this is the one that stood out. He said this: "I don't think you guys are going to get me to lose my composure here, but Sam LaPorta is as good a football player as I've ever coached. Probably the best one. He's an exceptional competitor, very talented, the way he practices, the way he plays. If my son could grow up, if he could just emulate that, whatever he chooses to do, I'd be awfully proud of him." Like, that is super high praise for Sam LaPorta. That one stood out to me, so I want to share that one before we get into who is Sam LaPorta. But yes, if you didn't know, Sam LaPorta is a tight end out of Iowa. And we're going to go through the measurables in a second here, but I also want to start off first with a little bit of the background. So this is a three-star recruit coming out of high school. And one thing that I thought was really interesting when you look at the background, we know this is tight end U, right? Iowa puts out tight ends: Hawkinson, Noah Fant, George Kittle. They put out way more than just that. They put out a lot of tight ends. There are a lot of successful tight ends, not necessarily meaning they're always the highest draft pick. Hawkinson was round 1, top 10, but George Kittle was a 5th-round pick. But when you look at the background of a lot of these guys, I thought it was interesting to see how a lot of them weren't, really highly touted recruits coming out of high school that landed in Iowa, because you would think, like, okay, if they were huge recruits, would they decide to go to Iowa? If they're 5-star recruits, is that where they would choose to go? Or are they just a factory at developing these guys? And I think it's more of the second part there of developing these players, like a George Kittle, who came out as a small 200-pound receiver frame that transitioned to playing the tight end position. Sam LaPorta, in high school, he played wide receiver and defensive back in the state of Illinois. That's where his hometown is. Illinois high school history: he has 50 receiving touchdowns, which is second in Illinois high school history. He's third in receiving yards with 3,793 yards. He was a 3-star high school prospect that chose to go to Iowa over schools like Central Michigan and Bowling Green. And even Kirk Ferentz said it himself, like, they feel like, hey man, we may have overlooked him basically when recruiting him. We're just grateful that, he came here and we were able to get his mom to come over here and choose this school. He was a 3-star recruit coming out of high school, but that's not unlike some of these other tight ends. TJ Hawkinson, who was a 2-star and a 3-star recruit, depending on who you were looking at there, coming out of high school. He decided to choose Iowa over schools like Eastern Michigan and Iowa State. George Kittle, who came out in 2012, had no D1 offers until signing day, and that was when Iowa reached out and offered him. And he came in, and he was a guy that was on the lighter side because he played receiver in high school, just like Sam LaPorta did, and he was a guy that was fast. They say that he lived on wheel routes, and then LeVar Woods, the coach, got to him and pushed him to be a better blocker, and that's when you started to see him kind of take off like the next season. And then you see the RAS scores and how athletic he is, right? They've had some athletic players like the Hawkinsons. He looked like a really big receiver playing in high school, but they've had these athletic players that were not highly recruited necessarily coming out, but have developed into great tight ends by the time that they did come out. And then, as we know, they've had some success in the NFL as well. When you take a look at some of the background in terms of the athletic scores here for Sam LaPorta, you can see he's a 6'3", 245-pound tight end. So he's not the biggest tight end. He's not 6'6". He's not the throw up, jump ball, go up and get it type of guy. And you'll see that when we start to look at him a little bit here. His arm length isn't great either, 32 and 1/8 inch arms, but he does have big hands, over 10 inches. That's something that was similar to Tucker Kraft that stood out to me when I was looking at him. Moving to some of the testing scores, the relative athletic scores, he tested out really well here. And then you start to, again, look at some of those other tight ends that have come out of Iowa, and they tested out extremely well as well. But the 4.59 40 time, which was an elite score for him, the 10-yard split is a 1.55, is incredible. I think that shows up a lot off the line, but there's legit burst to his game, and that's huge. The 1.55 10-yard split. The 3-cone drill, a 6.91. The short shuttle, a 4.25. The vertical jump, 35 inches, which is pretty good. The broad jump was pretty good. The only areas where he didn't test out necessarily well is size, bench press, which is similar to some of these other tight ends as well, outside of like Noah Fant, who I think was like 22 bench press reps. Noah Fant was just a freak athlete across the board. But outside of size and arm length and then bench press reps, he was really good in every other category, and he even talked about that like it was like 2 days, and then he's like, you know what, man, I don't want to sit here and just be lazy. Let's just get to work and get ready for this combine. Obviously, he showed up. But I start to compare that to players like a George Kittle, who had another great RAS score. He had the same vertical jump. He had a fantastic broad jump, even better there. 4.5240 is actually better than Sam LaPorta. He's out in a similar weight and height as Sam LaPorta, but he ran a 4.5240. But his 10-yard split isn't as good at a 1.59 there. But you can see a lot of the testing numbers, 3 cone drill, short shuttle, like a lot of the testing numbers are similar. And then again, for him, only 18 bench press reps was the worst area that he graded out in. Aside from having longer arms, you know, there's some similarities there to a George Kittle. Even a TJ Hawkinson, who had a better vertical jump with the 37.5 inches, but a little bit of a worse recone drill. You know, the 4.740, which is, you know, a tenth of a second basically slower than Sam LaPorta, a slower 10-yard split, basically the same bench press reps. He has longer arms. His size was a little bit better, 250 plus, 6'4.5". But again, you could see like they have athletes over there coming out of Iowa, and Sam LaPorta is exactly that. And then you start to dive into some of these statistics of Sam LaPorta. 2021, he had 18 more receptions than the second most on the team, and in 2022, he had 24 receptions more than the second most. 2019 was like the one year that he didn't lead the team in receptions, but the last 2 years he took off there. The number, I mean, he's got, you know, the most, I think, receptions in Iowa history, and we know, again, the tight ends that they've put out. The big thing that stands out here with Sam LaPorta is probably the limited amount of touchdowns. Some of that is the lack of getting targets there. He actually has a healthy amount more drops specifically than touchdowns in his career at Iowa. But again, I start to look at the Gerald Everett's and Tyler Higbee's, who he reminded me of in a sense when they were drafted by the Rams when Brad Holmes was there. Just a style of play that they brought to the table. Those guys are not big red zone threats either. Actually, if you look at their NFL careers, for example, Gerald Everett had 8 touchdowns in his 4 first years with the Rams. Tyler Higbee has 20 touchdowns in 7 years with the Rams. Like, that's not big touchdown numbers, and I don't think that's what the Lions were necessarily looking for here. But what stands out is the yards are good and a lot of receptions, and the fact that, of course, he lined up everywhere. Now, he's young. He's only 22 years old. He's a 4-year senior to love. When you start to talk about the character, we said the same thing about Jack Campbell, is the fact that he played in the bowl game. Now, for him, it was even different because he was coming off of a torn meniscus. Suffered a torn meniscus against Minnesota on a big run after catch. He suffered a torn meniscus, and he decided to come back, even though it was kind of put out there that he wasn't at 100%. He decided to come back and play in that Kentucky game. And I legitimately think you can make the argument, but man, he looked like as good as he did in the entire season, specifically with the ball in his hands. Like, it looked like Kentucky just couldn't tackle. It was like he had his best play of the year, I would say, with like the 6 broken tackles on the one play that was shown on the highlight reel at the draft. Like, that was the nastiest play I saw of him of the entire season in that game. And even in that game, it wasn't like he was just out there in the starter. Like, he kind of had to work his way back into it. But the fact that he decided to play, he said he wanted to be out there, you know, one more time with this guy. He said basically that Iowa has given him, you know, more than he could have ever asked for. And that's just the type of player that you're getting. He just wants to play. And I think that fits into, of course, the culture of guys that just love football, the football character, all of those things from the outside looking in. But it also fits into what Farron said and kind of just the way that he handles himself, the way that he practices, the talent that he has obviously showed up in that game. You look at some of the advanced stats here. 6 drops this past season, according to PFF. That's a 9% drop rate. It's not actually a lot of drops, even though, you know, I knocked his ball skills when he was coming out. We're going to talk about that because I do have some knocks there. He doesn't have a ton of like easy drops. There are some on there that we'll see, but he doesn't drop a ton of passes, even though, again, he does have more drop passes than touchdown passes. But again, that's just kind of how they utilize the guy. But you do see 6 contested grabs, and I don't even think he's great in that area, but that's tied for 12th, which again, I think it just comes back to where he's getting targets because he's only 18 of 44 on his career, which is 37.5%. That's not very good, especially when you think of a tight end. A lot of times people think, oh, security blanket. That's the guy you throw it to for 2 yards, and it's like he's catching everything. Like, it's a little bit of a different style, but it's also a different NFL, if we're being honest. 24 missed tackles, according to PFF. That was second for everybody that they graded this past year out of that position. And as I said, you know, Tucker Kraft was, I thought, the second best after the catch. He was the best in the class after the catch. And it was the game against South Dakota State where he literally had 2 receptions. And I sat there and said, oh, this guy's a problem with the ball in his hands. Like, this guy doesn't look normal. I mean, he looks different when the ball is in his hands, and you can see it by that statistic alone. I didn't even know that stat at the time. I just said, oh, goodness, he only has 2 receptions, but when the ball's in his hands, he looks like a different guy. And I even wrote that down when I was writing down the report for him. Is like, he just turns into a whole different player when the ball gets in his hands, to the point where at Kentucky, they started using him in a wildcat. I mean, they had some quarterback depth questions, so, you know, there was potential for him to get reps there, and at the end of the game, they put him in the wildcat. Had him run the ball twice. He had a handoff in there, but, like, that's the kind of talent that you have, and I think Brad Holmes even touched on that. But let's dive into the player. Let's dive into the film a little bit here, and I think what you're getting, what he brings to the table. We're going to bounce around a little bit between being a pass catcher and as a blocker, but I first want to start off with him as a pass catcher. These are the tight ends that get drafted high. Tight ends with ball skills, tight ends that have the receiving background. Like, you're not getting tight ends that are going round 1 that are big-time blockers and have 7 receptions. Those guys are usually UDFAs. We've signed a couple of those with very limited receiving productions coming out of college. We've signed a couple guys like that. The Brock Wrights. We had the guy from Ohio State. He didn't make the roster, I don't think, but we've had guys like that. The guys that get drafted high at tight end are the guys that have big-time receiving production. They can be mismatch problems, athletically speaking, and this is a guy that falls into that category in his own sense. You know, it's not like you put him in every situation, like he's just that guy. There's certain situations that fit him, but definitely in our offense, I brought it up when we first drafted him. I was like, man, I'm just thinking of, you know, the chip flats, just the check downs, and he's very good at chip flats, by the way, but just the check downs we'll throw to him, and instead of getting like, oh, hey, you just take what's there, like, he's going to be able to create more after the catch. He's going to be able to pick up a lot more ground a lot faster, and he's also able to make some guys miss. So there's that ability, and that partly makes him a mismatch problem, but it's way beyond that. The guy can separate. What of a rarity for tight ends. Now, of course, if you get a guy that's like, you know, 6'4", 210 pounds, you're calling him a tight end, him getting separation, it's a little bit like, okay, but he's kind of a tweener. But this guy legitimately has the build of a tight end. Now, he knows he's got to improve in his blocking, and he's even said that, like, hey, I know I got to improve. I got a lot of room to improve as a blocker. But when you look at his frame, I think he can get a little bit stronger, especially in the lower body. I think he needs to get a lot stronger there currently. But with that being said, the ability to separate, not a ton of tight ends with a tight end build can legitimately do that. And I'm talking about on defensive backs. That's the thing that can make you special. When you can really separate. And it was like George Kittle. He was a 5th round pick, but the upside was there. The guy ran a 4.52. They were just like, hey, run wheel routes. They can't keep up with you. There's upside there to separate. And when that's the case, you can become a very big problem. Travis Kelce with a 3rd round pick, by the way. So you just think about the 2 best tight ends arguably in the game. They both weren't high draft picks. But either way, with that being said, let's talk about this for a second. I want to start with some of the route running first. We'll start at the line of scrimmage because the craftiness that he wins with at the line of scrimmage stands out immediately. First off, when he's in the line, the ability to separate in line. There's a lot of guys that get off the line. Either 1, it's not that quick, or 2, they have to deal with a lot of traffic at the line of scrimmage. They get chipped and bumped off the line. It slows down the release, and then it becomes an issue. We know LaPorta can align everywhere. He's lined out wide, slot, H-back, tight end, inline. You know, he's aligned everywhere. But with that being said, heck, the guy lined at quarterback. He's lined up everywhere, but the ability to win at the line of scrimmage, no matter where he lines up, is what stands out to me first and foremost, because that's the first part of the route tree. He's very crafty off the line of scrimmage. He can really get off the line, in line. He has a lateral first step that allows him to avoid some contact. We've seen guys completely whiff on him, some of the sidestep. The agility, I think he took at the 3-cone drill here. You look at the 10-yard split, there's legitimate burst when he wants to get upfield. He is a seam threat. Like, putting him with a linebacker and just asking him to cover him without help over top, he's going to run by the linebacker. So just to keep it very simple, he's going to run past that guy. They have to win by getting their hands on it. But then you also kick him out wide. For example, this play against Ohio State, and you watch him beat the press against Ohio State, where you see him press the toes of the cornerback who's sitting outside leverage, so he kind of leans into that. And then you see the hand swipe, the ability to separate, plant, drive, and then make that slant. This is like Cooper Kupp's fade touchdown in the Super Bowl. So you're going to see him push the cornerback who's sitting outside leverage to get him to open up. Then as he does, he goes that swipe. But look at the ankle flexion. Sink on his left foot, then plant with that 45-degree angle off the right. Really has burst out of those, 45-degree angle type of cuts, the slant cuts. They use them a lot of times in those bunch situations, which made me really think a lot. Remember in 2021, we were kind of running those types of routes, like some of the option routes with tight ends, what we did somewhat of last year with running backs. And I said, hey, I think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be huge here. But when you run some of those routes where you kind of stack both tight ends on top of each other and they break off and they have to kind of feel the coverage, that's something they did with Sam LaPorta. Usually he was the guy that would play off the line of scrimmage. That way he wasn't getting bumped. But to make those reads, be able to plant, stick in the ground, and then attack the middle of the field with some of that burst, the ability to separate in those instances. But then to just see him go out wide and be able to separate on slants, some of those types of angles, and you'll see it really all over the field when he's taking those types of angles. This is where I really like some of the football intelligence as a route runner here from LaPorta. So here he's matched up on 30 on the top. That's Sidney Brown. And then you can see the cornerback matched up man on 85. They're essentially stacking this with their two tight ends. But he's going to push the outside here, stack up this route, and almost try to force a switch. The cornerback then decides to bail and not switch. Now 85 is a step. As soon as he does that, LaPorta plants, breaks back inside. Why? Because Sidney Brown is having to try to attack and get over top. So if they don't decide to switch, all of a sudden now he's got to stop his movement and then reset and cover him back inside. LaPorta knows that. He stays under control, but he pushes this route until he recognizes that they're not going to switch, and then he breaks inside for space. But that transitions into kind of the stem of the route. And this is where I think, man, I think he's overlooked here in terms of his craftiness. And look, I mean, really, I had to keep watching over and over here. And I'm just like, man, I think he's really good at this. The ability to win at the stem of the route, specifically against off coverage. So a lot of times you'll get safeties matched up with you. So recognizing that matchup, who do I have first off? Sometimes it's a linebacker. Sometimes it's a slot corner, depending on where you're lined up. But when he has room off the line, 5+ yards, the cornerback is off. When you have those situations and you start to see the way that he's able to create leverage on those routes through the stem, not playing through contact, but just setting it up with the route pacing, with some of the subtle angles that he takes into that approach. Like, this is an area where I feel like he's really good. And again, you speak to some of the separation upside. He can handle a pretty complex, route tree, but this is what makes him difficult. And I think it really showed up in this Illinois game when you were throwing Jartavius Martin at him. You were throwing Sidney Brown at him, like guys that are supposed to be able to stick with him a little bit better, because he's not the biggest guy, so he's not going to win by just throw it up, let him go get it. That's not how he wins. He legitimately had to separate, and he legitimately did separate. He knows how to gain leverage for the top of the route versus off coverage, and he has a feel for opening up the defender if he doesn't have leverage. So for example, there was one against Sidney Brown where he keep pushing that, stay disciplined in his stem to get it to open up, and as soon as you see it open up, he attacks. Or if you get a defender that's lined up and they do have leverage, so he's working through that route stem and they're sitting in his way, they still have it, he'll get to the top of his route, he'll give you a little bit of that stutter, that sidestep, and then kind of the burst out of the break, and all of a sudden that creates the lunge, and all he's trying to do is attack the half of the body of the defender, and he does so good at doing that, changing speeds, subtle movement, staying disciplined through the stem to really make a safety or a cornerback or the linebacker believe that he's going to break one way, and then it's just about finding and picking his spots, being so decisive with like, okay, now I want to attack. Has leverage, for the route pre-snap, and he doesn't necessarily have to try to open a defender up. He won't even hit the gas. Like, he won't just accelerate to the spot that he's trying to get to break off his route, because then of course the defender can adjust and off coverage, step in front of it, and it can be difficult for him to get space. So instead, he'll come out and he'll run at a little bit of a slower pace. He'll slowly kind of work his way there until he feels that he's even, and now once he turns on the gas, now all of a sudden the defender's caught in a little bit of a trail position. He's got just a step that he needs, right? You just got to create a step. Just create a step to get open, and that's what he does. He creates that step, he's able to break off his route, and then all of a sudden he's got room. And you're just like, man, he can beat all of these. Like, he's beating any matchup that gets thrown at him because he's very crafty in that sense as a route runner. Now, that's not to say he's a perfect route runner, because I don't think that he is, but that is something that stood out with some of the awareness there, the change of speeds, all of those things. And now I do think he loses some speed when it comes to breaking over the middle, for example, like running some dig route, can make a really tight cut. I think you'll see him, he has to kind of, pull up a little bit in some of the speed, or at the same time, the route may fade off a little bit. So if it's out breaking route, in breaking route, the route may fade a little bit, but it'd be the most tight and crisp route if he's trying to keep up with the speed that he's running the stem with. If he really turns it on and he's trying to run through the break and maintain that speed, that you're going to see that break fade a little bit. It won't be as tight, but again, he's a tight end, so I guess some of that's probably a little bit of expected. So some of that is, I do think at times there's some lacks of awareness in terms of tacking coverage. Not necessarily the guy that's matched up with him. If he knows the man that's matched up on him, or when he's reading in some of those bunch situations, when to break and things like that, some of the option routes, I think you see a very good player. But I think where you get some awareness lapses is usually the second defender, realizing, okay, where's the second defender on his play? Sometimes you'll get him, running across through zone coverage, and it feels like he's kind of running himself into zone coverage, but then there's also times against man coverage when, for example, against Michigan, it was a good one, where the safety's rolled down and he's kind of just sitting inside leverage, where you see him kind of round the top of the break. Now the safety's kind of sitting in the way, and he's not making that steep or necessarily working himself in front of the safety to take away his leverage. He's letting that defender create leverage, the second defender, through the play. So I think sometimes you see lapses in awareness of the second defender that jumps into the picture for him, beyond just like who's covering him initially. I think he's usually really good at recognizing that, but it's finding the second defender and then approaching it to create leverage, step in front of passes, make himself the big target, box out the defender. You don't really get that type of player right now, and I think some of that can just come with recognition. Some of it's also sort of play style as well. But again, speaking to the upside as a separator, he's got plus bursts out of his cuts, which is huge. You saw him draw the holding penalty against Illinois. Like, you know, it was an incomplete pass, but he drew a holding penalty. This is really one of the nastiest routes I've seen from a tight end in this draft class. Notice the loose hips and the discipline, and also the second gear speed and how he decides to use this. Here, the discipline, upfield, then the cut. As soon as he starts to feel that cornerback's weight shift, then the plant, second gear, steps on the gas, then you can see the loose hips there to open it up and then finish. When he's really trying to hit his speed and he's trying to sink at the top of the route, it can be a little bit stiffer. So for him, I think if he used his size a little bit better, meaning if he used the advantage that he has on pretty much any defensive backs that's matched up on him, because when you put him with a corner or a safety, a lot of times, especially in the NFL, you know, you're going to get guys that can match much better with some of the bursts that he has. So you're not getting that as much separation as he may get. He may get the step, but if you're asking him to get a step and then sink back down and run a curl route or a hitch route, which I don't think we're going to ask him to do a ton of those, but if you're asking him to separate at level 1 on a hitch route against this cornerback or a safety, it's going to be difficult for him to create a ton of separation on that route, even if he does initially, because at the top of the route, for him to be really moving and not give up ground, because like I said, here's a great example. He separates off the line here against a defensive back. As we said, he can really do that. But then as he's working through the stem, for him to try to continue to build on that separation, the defensive back, he's working hard to maintain that speed. The defensive back can recover. But then when you then have to sink at that kind of speed, it's a little bit difficult. So what you see is he'll start to kind of hit the brake like a step early than maybe a receiver would have to. He has to hit the brake early, so you'll get a couple of the extra steps into kind of that sink at the top route to flip himself around, spot himself up, or a hitch route. You'll see him have to kind of create an extra step to sink, and that allows the defensive back into the play. Whereas if he could improve in terms of, one, utilizing his hands, he improved the way that he kept himself clean. He allows guys to hang all over him too much. I don't like that. If he used his hands a little bit more aggressive in that sense, which is good, he doesn't get OPIs, but if he would use his hands on certain routes specifically to kind of say, hey, separate a little bit at the top of this route and then box the defender out, really put yourself in a position where you're like, hey, dude, you're behind me, I'm spotting up for this route. He hasn't been that like consistent spot up type of target. Like, you know, Michael Mayer comes to mind. It's like, I'm throwing a 5-yard hitch, I want to throw it to that guy. That's not always consistently creating separation. That was a great example, because I don't think he always uses his size to as much as an advantage as it could be. He's trying to win with some of the movement skills, and when you're on a defensive back, sometimes you have to lean on a little bit more, mixing in, okay, look, I'm bigger than you though. Even though I can move and all these things, fantastic, I am bigger than you. Let me lean on that for certain routes. Other routes is fine, don't even worry about it. But I think as a whole, he could use his hands more efficiently to create separation. But then when it comes to attacking zone coverage, while I said sometimes I feel like he can kind of run into zone coverage, what you do like as a route runner is the fluidity. You know, and again, this is the upside here. You saw it against Ohio State, even when he wasn't getting the ball, the fluidity to work himself through the off the ball linebackers, you know, at the line of scrimmage, or really, you know, at the second level, the fluidity which he can just change directions to kind of work around those guys on crossers through the stem while keeping and maintaining some speed. And that's where he's a problem. Like, you get him on routes that are rolling, for example, you know, when they would hit him on some of the angle routes, which is like, dude, a tight end running angle routes, come on now, and he's crisp. But when you get him running like crossers and drag routes and catch and run and, you know, zig routes, or, you know, the chip block, the chip flats, like, you get things like that, he's a problem, because the ball's going to get in his hands. That's where he becomes a nightmare. But with that being said, with the fluidity, he's able to kind of work through the stem of the route. Now you're getting him to sidestep, you know, linebackers in zone coverage, and he has those skills where it's like, I think he can be on the ground a little bit too often as a route runner. A lot of times it was like when he met a linebacker at the second level and maybe he was running some sort of, you know, out route on the play, 10, 15 yards down the field, and he kind of met that linebacker with contact, and then he was trying to make that break out of his cut, and he would slip and fall down. You did get a couple of those, sometimes even off the line of scrimmage. I thought, you know, maybe there's sometimes with some lack of awareness of a guy that could potentially disrupt his release off the line. Like, he's very aware of who's right in front of him and sidestepping that first matchup, but sometimes it was like, hey man, there's a off-ball linebacker, maybe he's just kind of lurking out there, or maybe it's more he's in a 9 tech, you know, he's not really realizing it, and then he kind of gets into his release, and all of a sudden he gets like chucked on the side, and it's like he almost didn't even recognize that was necessarily there. And again, back to the part about using his hands a little bit more, that's even the point. Like, he would like to use a lot of the, you know, movement skills, and he likes to kind of dip his shoulder around contact and kind of lean by it, maintain his speed. I understand all of that, but again, at times I think he could be a little bit more, you know, kind of proactive with his hands. Like, hey dude, get off me. All right, you're not going to just chuck me as I run by. Like, get off me. You know, that kind of thing. What I like is his discipline and feel for where the sticks are, where the route net depth needs to get to in terms of like, oh, okay, it's a 3rd and 2, I'm running this little route, I need to make sure that I'm sticking on the first down marker here. Or maybe he'll even fade out to the first down marker. But understanding where the sticks are, that kind of thing, like he gets thrown the ball a lot in clutch situations. And sometimes it works, sometimes it didn't for Iowa, but they like to go to him. It's one of his better strengths to me is he's a clutch receiving option. They like to go to him in the big moments. Now, they kind of just went to him in general because as a pass game, it was a mess. But he was the guy that they would like to get the football to in clutch situations. So I loved the recognition there. There was a really good example. It was a 3rd down 11 against Ohio State, and I think they ended up calling him like inches short. But you saw him stick on the line, and when the ball is short, he's not necessarily going to run off the first down line to go get it. He's going to do the best to kind of stick on where the first down sticks are, and then just lunge out to try to make that grab and pull it back to himself so that he can maintain the first down. And you could see that that's just the way that he's approaching that. So there's a legitimate awareness of where the depth needs to get on his route reception. You know, really, you look at the upside, there's ability that can separate against everybody. You got to be excited about it. And you just love the way that he plays, man. He's an absolute competitor. He's feisty, and that shows up everywhere. But we'll continue with that a little bit more. Now let's move on to some of the hands for him. And as I said, when I first watched him, I remember I had some ball skills questions, but I really didn't dive into exactly what those were. I just knew I had some questions. Obviously, statistically speaking, there were some drops. It's nothing terrible, but it's more so the lack of contested grabs, which I think stands out to people. Tight end, a lot of times you think of like that big body, throw it up to him, go get it, red zone, 6'7", like he's going to just pull it down. You think of a Davis Allen out of Clemson. That's not Sam LaPorta necessarily, and I don't think that's ever going to be someone that you ask to be that guy. But with that being said, his hands, how are his ball skills? Well, let's start there. He utilizes late hands a lot, and I think certain instances it makes a ton of sense. First off, he's all about yards that he can create after the catch. He's all about that. We're going to talk about it. I love it. Like, he has trust in his hands. He's going to maintain discipline of the route, breaking off the route without fading to try to adapt to the football. So he trusts his hands, but he gets a lot of late hands looking to kind of maintain that speed. You saw it against Purdue. You saw it against Wisconsin. Clear that he's more reliable. If you were just asking, like, if you threw him 100 passes, how is he going to catch more passes? When you throw him a laser within 10 yards or when you throw him a touch pass? Definitely the touch pass, because some of those passes specifically, I don't think as much downfield as it is more so in the short yardage range. When you're throwing some of those lasers at him, that's when you get sometimes the ball can almost kind of get through his hands because they come out very late a lot of times. And again, it's not something that was usually an issue. He has a lot of confidence in his hands, and it's not even, to me, it's not even a pass catching technique thing. It's just that he gets his hands out really late. And usually I find when it's the close quarters passes that get high when he's not expecting it to. Usually he has his arms pumping, but when he kind of stops and sits, his arms get to his hips. So when the ball comes up high quickly, he doesn't have the quickness to get his hands up because they were just sitting a lot of times. And that's where he can occasionally pop up his issues as he gets his hands out late, clearly, and the ball just tips off his hands because he doesn't get his hands up soon enough. Some of that also, I think you would like to see him be a little more proactive in how he reacts to it, positioning himself a little bit more early to the play, like Ohio State, for example. Positioning himself a little bit quicker. I think he's extremely twitchy to reacting to the football when the ball gets away from his frame, especially, and I'll give him some credit to this, is like Iowa, their quarterback, he threw a lot of passes before the break, and you're going to get that in the NFL, but there was a lot of passes that came out very, very early, so they were on him like instantly. So sometimes I felt like there was some late ball tracking there, like realizing where it was at and adapting to it. Other times I just thought he reacted late to the football. So those two things kind of, I think, can go hand in hand a little bit. I do think he had plus body control, catch point, rescue some passes that were thrown behind him with ease, and then again, still being able to maintain the run after the catch. Just because it was behind him, it didn't mean that he was going to catch it and fall down. Like, he was able to react to it, flip his body around while running his route, catch the pass, and then continue running. Like, I think you had a plus ability in that sense, and he's got very big hands, which shows up. That's a big part of it as well. He's got big hands at the catch point, so he kind of just snagged things, and I do think he has quick eyes. So even though I knock that, at times the ball gets on him quickly, and I didn't know if he even knew where the ball was sometimes, I do think you do see some quick eye reaction. I think this shows up with the ball in his hands as well. You'll get some quick eye reactions to where the football is and being able to react with his hands. I just don't think he's so super twitchy in the body to necessarily react to the ball getting super far outside his frame. He also doesn't have fantastic arm length either. Can disrupt him a little bit at the catch point as well, because sometimes I would like to see him attack the ball more than he does. Like, he kind of lets it come to him a little bit. Now, sometimes it's perfectly fine, but there are instances, and I think some of this ties back to route running and leveraging and getting himself in front of a defender, but also the same thing as a receiver. There are times where I'd like to see him go get the football rather than kind of letting it come to him a little bit. Again, he plays through the route where he expects the ball to be, but there are times where it's like, hey man, you got to forget that. Defender is like breaking on the football. Let me jump in front of that. He catches with his hands, so don't get that, like everything's a body catch. He does catch with his body on some of the bucket passes and in certain instances on the sideline, like when he's sliding down for it, but I don't think because of that he doesn't have ball skills in the sense that his pass catching technique, I think, is good. His ability to naturally flip his hands, get his thumbs up, catch the pass, utilize, not only his hands, but also when it comes into his chest a little bit. The biggest thing there is that sometimes he could just fly through a little bit too fast in short yardage situations. That's where you want to see him be a little more proactive and getting his hands out there a little bit earlier. But I think he has good ball skills, technically speaking, just that the ball can get through his hands a little bit, and there are times where you'd like to see him be a little bit more of the aggressor, more of the attacker at the catch point as well. But again, some of that's a lack of arm length, but the positive is that he does have big hands. Now, what ties this all together, and it works well for him, and after catch and the yards after catch that he's able to create. This is where everything kind of ties together for him, and this is the area which, again, like I said, when I first watched him, first game with South Dakota State, dude had 2 receptions, but I was like, man, this guy with the ball in his hands looks different, right? That was the first thing that stuck out to me, and it's legit when you continue to watch him. However, with that being said, I did think his best run was literally that Kentucky run, and it was weird because, like, dude, you're coming off an injury. How is that your best run? Like, all season, I didn't see a run like that, though. But with that being said, that's where he becomes a problem, and he does a great job of route understanding in terms of when he's running those chip flats, when he's running a drag route, when he's running a crosser. His goal is not to catch the football. His goal is to catch the ball and create after catch. He's trying to make everything happen as soon as the ball gets in his hands. He wants to do more. Like, he understands the development of that route, but the over routes, they're not for him to just catch the ball and slide down. It's for him to do something with the ball in his hands. It's for him to be more of a playmaker, if you will, with the ball in his hands. And that's where he ties everything together. There's literally no delay, a lot of times noticeable, between the catch and run with him. It is so smooth. It's so fluid. Like, he won't even slow down sometimes to make the grab. He stays disciplined to the route angle that he's taking. He's going to stay on that, and he's going to make the catch. But you're not going to see him, like, fly off his line to, like, oh, I got to go set myself up to just make this grab. Like, you know how you play Madden and, so you have the X button, which is like possession catch, and you have the square button, which is RAC? He's clicking RAC all the time.
Come back to the ball. Come back to the ball.
Get a guy that plays with very good concentration at the catch point. I think he has pretty fast eyes in that sense. So while that transition is very smooth for him, the catch to the run, it makes a ton of sense because at the same time, that's where one of his biggest strengths in his game is, and that is when the ball is in his hands. And I wrote it down like this, man. He becomes an animal when the ball is in his hands. Specifically speaking, it's like he has a sixth sense that takes over with the football in his hands. And I think you saw it in that Kentucky play. You see the fast eyes. Like, his eyes are just flying around, his head is moving, and he's just making plays, and it just looks so natural. Brad even talked about it. Like, we asked him, like, hey man, were you a running back in the past? Like, nah, I didn't play running back. But I think when you do watch him, like, you see that, like, he just looks super natural when the ball's in his hands. He's looking to make plays as soon as the ball hits his hands. There's a lot of good traits that come along with that. First off, finding space. He has a really good feel for it. He's constantly keeping his eyes on a swivel, working his way downhill. He's not, blindly just running straight and running fast. Obviously, he has the speed. He has a legitimate burst, which is a problem. He can plant and get upfield on some of those tight end screens that they throw him, so that pops up as well. But their stop and start ability, come to balance, I think is huge for him. And then it's also that body control that kind of ties in with it. Like, he's very balanced on contact, so he has good contact balance because of that. He's very active with his hand usage. You'll get, stiff arms thrown in there. You'll get him using his hands to come to balance. The ball hits his hands. He has a sixth sense for running the football. It's just natural for him. He looks like a running back running the football, just the feel for having the ball in his hands, finishing through contact, finishing forward, that kind of thing, man. But he's just rumbling forward. He picks some momentum, and he's even tougher in that sense, but he's very good with the ball in his hands. He's very good as a run after catch player. Get to the blocking here in a second, but I do like the effort and gritty type of player, and that stood out to me when you talk about some of the turnovers that they had offensively, and the fact that he's the guy making tackles on the situations. One was throwing his guy, one wasn't. The one that was throwing his guy, like, he goes out there and he makes the tackle. There's like no question, like, oh, why'd you throw that? Like, he's immediately like, I'm tackling that guy. And man, he laid some nice tackles, but that effort carries over to him as a blocker, the way that he blocks. But you're getting a very physical type of player. Like, you're getting a great temperament, I should say, and I think even Kirk Ferentz said that. Like, you're getting a great temperament for a blocker. This is, yes, a lower grade for me than the receiving side for the tight end. I have him slightly basically above average as a whole here as a blocker. Actually, I have him with a higher grade as a pass protector than as a run blocker. But with that being said, I think based on his skill set, there's a way that he can be very impactful early. And then on top of that, I think there's definitely upside down the road for him to continue to improve, get better here. I think you do want to see more strength in general. specifically in the lower body, continue to get more movement, specifically when he's in line. You don't get a lot of movement. A lot of times it's like, man, he's taking the brunt of that hit. You know what I'm saying? Like, you just want more power to his game for an inline blocker. Let's start right there. Here's one way that I really like him. So we talk about the athleticism as a player, and this is something I do think stands out as a blocker as well. He has tons of acceleration, specifically off the line of scrimmage, and this shows up as an inline blocker. For example, if he's blocking off the backside, or even if he was working in the slot or a wide position and he's trying to cut off a safety, like that speed that he has to not only get to the second level, but to also get up to the third level, cut off a block, cut off a pursuit potentially from a defensive back or maybe even from a linebacker. That speed that he has to get in front of those blocks is going to be huge for him off the backside of some of those zone runs, maybe some of the wide zone runs that we may do with Jahmyr Gibbs, that kind of thing. Like, that's an area that I think he could be beneficial. And what ties it all in together with him well is the grittiness that he shows. Like, I'm not just saying that to say it. Like, that's the kind of way that he plays, and it stood out to me first as a blocker before as a receiver, and that's because of the second and third effort you get from him as a blocker, just looking for work all the time. Even on as simple as, hey man, someone else caught a pass on the other side of the field, he's going to start looking for work as a blocker. How can I get in front? How can I lead block for this? That's just the way that he plays. Not even a design screen. He's just looking for work all the time, whether that's in a pass game or the run game. So you get tons of effort for him, finding work downfield on pass plays, something I really liked. Now, when you talk about some of the recognition and some of the football intelligence as a blocker, I do think you get lapses, and here's one of my biggest issues here, in terms of some of the recognition when working into the second level, finding his targets and being able to square up those targets. He'll get definitely a lot of times where he runs himself past the block, or he'll get his feet over his shoulders, and at that point there's no force into contact. He doesn't get a lot of leverage, and then he gets sidestepped very easily, gets completely whiffed. So you get some of that. You also see a lot of times he tries to string out some of the defenders on the play. For example, if he's on the side, if he's on the front side of a wide zone play, he's going to try to string out those edge players instead of always lining them up, and sometimes they could just run right by him. But I do think there's also some of the lapses of recognition. For example, when he's being asked to block between the tackles, he's used as a lead blocker, he's lined up as the H-back, like he's been used to do things like that. So whether it's usually being lined up as an H-back to lead block in between the tackles, it's finding that target, specifically if the first guy that he's going after gets blocked up or he's not in a position to block him and he has to move on to the next target. Finding that target to accurately lay a good block is, I think, where you get some lapses in recognition. When it's easier for him to read his target and he can actually get square to his target, you get some good blocks and you can see the effort that he gives. But I still would like to see more knee bend. It really shows up in line as he gets essentially no movement, even when in some combo blocks, because I don't think there's enough knee bend there, and there's definitely a lack of play strength. Love the athleticism to work up to that level as a blocker. He's a very reactive blocker in terms of specifically when it shows up on split zone blocks. When he's the guy working opposite of the flow of the zone. Split zone, usually they leave like the edge free on the play and he has to kind of pick that up, and they ask him to like absorb the contact basically. Sometimes they cut block there, but for him, he does a good job, gets a wide base, usually absorbs the contact. They've also used him on wham plays where the tight end is asked to kind of work his way in and then pick up a defensive tackle because they leave him free, center or guard, they shoot up to the second level and they block up there. So you have to basically just cut off that defensive tackle in his tracks. So you'll get ability to do that and kind of just absorb that contact, even though again, for him, the biggest thing is ahead of the block and not being able to get much force into the block or creating more consistent leverage into it. But I do like a recognition of a split zone blocker to recognize when a defensive tackle gets through the offensive line to kind of slide off of his block there and really get a hit on the defensive lineman that got through free to try to open up the run and keep the run alive. That way it doesn't just die behind the backfield, because that is a risk of zone run. Point that I just made, just to touch on more time, some of that backside speed, you saw it against Ohio State. If guys lined up in a 7 technique, meaning like inside shade of a tight end, the foot quickness that he has to get in front of that block and cut it off the backside is there. And I think right now, too often, you get a guy that's not necessarily laying the block as much as he is just kind of taking the block, absorbing the contact, not getting as much, leverage as you would like. I think he gets some minimal movement, specifically when he's in line. He doesn't have a ton of strength, it doesn't look like, in the lower body to get that movement. Doesn't always get the best leverage, even though he's not 6'6". It should be a little bit easier for him here, so I think there's upside to definitely get leverage. You see that, but creating leverage into contact is something that can be improved upon for sure based on his game right now. now when he's locked in line. But then, as I said, when he's working to the second and the third level, it's making sure that he keeps his feet basically under him. He get his feet that tend to just kind of stop moving. And this is kind of hit and miss, right? Sometimes his feet move through blocks, and I think you see that show up, and I'll talk about that in a second. But where I think he's at his best as a blocker is when he's out in space, when he's on the move, when he's used like a polar and he's getting outside the tackle box and he's leading the way on those stretch runs. Like when he's getting out wide and he's able to just kind of go find targets, that's where I think he's at his best, because then you start to get more of that consistent leg drive. Be a little bit easier for him to kind of square into some of those blocks, but then at that point you get his legs that kind of drive through contact. Instead, he kind of have a tendency right now where without the proper technique into contact, you will get him, stopping his feet on contact. And then there's no movement. He's just basically absorbing the blow that comes this way. So being a little bit more of the guy that lays the block rather than the guy that's just kind of taking on the block, if you will. And I think he's much more ready right now to be a on the move blocker than he is a consistent winner in line. Talking about him as an inline blocker for a second, one area that I did like him was his combo blocks with tackles on defensive ends. Again, usually this is towards the front side of the play, but when he's able to work with a tackle on a defensive end on the front side of a play and combo block that, and then when working to the second level, he does a nice job there. The target's much more easy for him because, again, it's not like he has to square it up as much. He's kind of coming in from an angle. He's got very good reactive athleticism, which really helps him in pass protection to me, even though we didn't see him there a ton, but it helps him at the second and third level, and even on the line as a backside blocker to kind of reset himself and just stay in front of people. Just stay in front of people and at least make them have a second effort to win, because he does have the ability to kind of just flip his feet, reactive athlete. That's what he is. The combo block with the tackle, you'll see him close the airspace at the point of attack, really not allow that defensive end to get through and get that initial win. Probably have more cons than pros with him as an inline blocker, even though I do think he does some things well and there's really upside. He can get a nice base. He flashes getting squared up into his blocks, and then you see his ability to absorb contact. Sometimes he does get to lay the blow, and he saw it against Kentucky. He actually ran the guy over. Now, in the NFL, you get a lot of smaller linebackers, so he'll be able to match with those guys a lot better. Certain teams have bigger linebackers. You saw more problems. But with that being said, one, I think, of the biggest areas of issue, we talk about the arm length. He's got shorter arm length for his position, very short arms for his position. And obviously, when you're working against edge rushers, that can show up. His problem that I note is that I think he needs to be more active in terms of getting his hands on first, being a little bit more of the aggressor with his hands. I think he does a really nice job being disciplined. He keeps his hands very tight, very inside pad level, and then he works to reset. He's always working to reset, get his hands inside. You're not getting him grab on the shoulders and he's holding people. He does a really good job resetting his hands and coming in with initial tight hands, getting inside and trying to maintain, and that allows him to maintain some blocks. You'll see he's there to carry it a long way through. Athleticism to match steps of a defensive end or a linebacker trying to get off the block, and then he also has the big hands to get a really good grip when he gets a good grip. But to get more of a consistent grip on his blocks, I think he needs to be a little bit less of a catcher at that position and more of a guy that's kind of laying the initial hit as a blocker. I think right now he's a little bit of a catcher in his hands, right? We talk about that with tackles and pass pro. He's a little bit more of like, okay, it's happening. Oh, I got grabbed. Now I'm going to try to reset my hands to get in here. And then he doesn't have any control over the block. There were certain teams, I think like Purdue, he looked better. They weren't getting the control on the block. They weren't doing as well against him. But edge rushers specifically that get their hands on him early, he had problems trying to maintain any kind of control over those blocks for any amount of time. He just has below average some of that play strength in terms of just being able to move people with that alone. Like he really needs to create some momentum, I think, into contact to get consistent movement. Again, back to being that inline blocker on some of those zone blocks. You also get him way too often being a little bit either late to the block or, again, tying that along with not getting square into the block with good leverage. So I think even though he's only 6'3", this should be better. A lot of times you'll get him kind of vertical, you get him kind of linear. He's not a really wide base. Specifically, this happens on the backside of zone blocks, and he doesn't get a seal. I think he has to be much more proactive of like, hey, dude, I got to get in front of this guy. I can't be on the shoulder of him. When guys try to slant and shoot his gaps, too often they have success on the backside, and then he's not in a position where he can really sink and anchor, and all of a sudden they're slanting, and he's getting pushed back behind the line of scrimmage. It happened against Wisconsin. That's an area which I think could definitely use improvement. But these are types of things that I think, again, having a guy like Steve Hyden, who is an former offensive offensive line coach at one point, should be able to help him with these things, because I think there's a lot of room for growth here, because it flashes a lot of good, but then you get flashes the same types of blocks that don't look very good. Being utilized as lead blocker sometimes looks really good. Other times he's just taking on the contact and just getting blown up, and it's like there was no movement there. But other times, he gets pretty good contact. He's able to create a lane for the running back, takes on, half the body, and he's able to win a little bit more of the leverage battle because he's not the strongest player at the point of attack. For me, I like him the most on the move right now. He's a second, third effort type of player that keeps battling. I love the discipline to make sure that he gets his hands inside. That's something that I love. You don't get really many holding calls for him. And you saw like a couple times when he's used like a puller and he's just able to kind of lead the way, get outside the tackle box. He's able to get outside. DBs, like he's one of the better blockers on defensive backs that I've seen from a tight end. He can really thrive in that area because he can latch, he can match with his feet without getting called for holding. And then at the same time, he does a good job of getting inside hands and continuing to look for work. If the first guy, even if he misses, he's going to be on to the next. There's no like, oh, I missed him. Should I keep going? It's immediate. Okay, I'm on to the next. He just keeps working. And that's where I think he's at his best right now. I think there's upside to be a better inline blocker, but I don't think it's fantastic. Now, as a pass protector, I think he's a good pass protector. This one is much more of a projection because he didn't do, I could probably count on my hands how many times he was asked to pass protect. But where I think he is good here is he has the movement skills. And you even saw this as a pass protector. When he's able to get support, for example, someone chips the block first and then he's able to get his inside hands, he does a pretty good job. He has good reactive athleticism so he can move with the blocks. He has good inside grip, big hands. He's able to kind of maintain a little bit, at least from what you would expect of a tight end. Where the issues again come in play is when he doesn't get his hands on and all of a sudden they gain control first and now he's trying to reset, but there's no control over the block and he's getting thrown off almost immediately. What I like is the recovery ability. A lot of times, teams will use their tight ends if they're asked to pass protect, like run fake, split zone. Okay, we're going to have you do the split zone fake, but it's a play action, that kind of thing. So then it's like, okay, do you have the lateral athleticism slide, down the depth of the pocket and be able to kind of protect the edge of the pocket with some of your movement skills? That he does have. If he's out there on third down, he's probably being used to catch the ball somehow. Run a route, run a screen, some way like that. It's probably not your first choice to say, hey man, let's get this guy in there to pass protect. That's probably not why you're utilizing him. If anything, you put a sixth offensive lineman in. It's probably not exactly what he's going to be. But again, I think he's best as an attacking tight end blocker, get outside, that kind of thing, versus right now. And he was asked to block in a lot of ways. It's just hit and miss technique at this point in time, and there's not a ton of power to his game either as a blocker. So he's more of a athletic blocker at this point. Going through his grades, the receiving ability, man, I think he's a really good receiver. It's not great yet, but I think he's pushing that. When it comes to the blocking, I think he's kind of in that average range at best. Slightly above average is kind of where I penciled him in because I'm projecting that he's going to be a little bit of a better pass protector than maybe what some would expect just based on his skill set for what you would ask of a tight end. I got him as an average run blocker right now. You think he's a smart tight end? There's things that you like, things that you don't like in that sense. But for me, there's a lot of good grades here. A couple of lower ones like the play strength for me. Him as a run blocker I think is a little bit middling for me. But what I love is some of the traits of like he's tough as nails, man. That's one of my highest grades of his toughness. Run after catch, I think he could be a mismatch issue. The ability to release, really a lot of the receiving categories he has a very high grade for me. So for that being said, that's where he's going to be a tough piece for the Lions. And again, he reminds me of the Gerald Everett's, the Tyler Higbees, right? These guys that weren't big red zone, spot up, post up type of weapons. He's not necessarily like he's the extension of the offensive line. He's not that. He's a guy drags, crossers, seams, whatever you want to ask him, things that get him on the move, zigs, whip routes, if you will, right? Chip flats, those kind of things, screens, mid screens. You know how many screens we threw last year? And people would be like, man, we're throwing another screen. We throw a lot of screens. So for him, not only can he be effective as, hey, he can catch a screen, but I think he can be effective blocking on screens because he can get out there and he'll block and he'll work and he can maintain blocks better than most. So again, I think for our style, this makes sense. I think he's a different style than TJ Hockenson. I just think, again, not every tight end is going to be your cup of tea, but as Brad said, there was a lot of different flavors. He's a specific flavor, right? And to me, based on how we saw this offense run and based on Brad Holmes' past with the Rams, this is the kind of flavor that I think the Lions have looked for. They didn't use their tight ends. You think these last 2 years is like they're the big red zone threats. Hockenson was a nice red zone threat, but he didn't have like crazy red zone numbers. He was a nice red zone threat, but he'll be more of a red zone threat in terms of get the ball in his hands, let him run after catch, or trying to beat a matchup one-on-one, rather than just saying, let's throw fade fade routes to him over and over, unless there's a really tiny guy on him, and maybe you can do that. So, but again, that's not what the Rams tight ends were either. This is a matchup piece again, I think, at the tight end position. It's a better receiver than blocker right now, but man, like, there is tons and tons of upside to the player, and he's a fantastic athlete. This guy's an animal, man. I'm excited because when you start to watch him, you realize, like, oh, this guy looks like a receiver, kind of. Like, the movement skill, he looked kind of like a receiver. When we think about this year's draft board, we talked about potentially drafting a receiver high. Tight end was really good this year. So you took one of the best tight ends in this year's class. Makes a ton of sense to me. He's just a weapon. And I love the fact that we have a really good duo with him and James Mitchell for years to come. I'm very excited about that. I was excited about that idea coming into the draft when I had us taking Schoonmaker and Tucker Kraft and those kind of things. I'm really excited about these two working together and just having a nice little 1-2 punch. Boom, boom, with our tight ends, and just a movable piece, you know, not just your strictly inline blocker, but a guy that can go everywhere. With that being said, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'm out.